Most people never saw it coming. They missed it entirely, and Washington certainly isn't broadcasting it. But here is the reality. When Trump declared that America doesn't need Canada, that wasn't simply a political point being scored. That statement wasn't bravado for the cameras. It was a gamble, and one that is beginning to backfire in ways that Americans are only now starting to grasp. While everyone's attention was locked onto the headlines, Canada was quietly pivoting, quietly preparing, and quietly reshaping the energy, trade, and strategic landscape in ways that could define the coming decade for the United States. And what most Americans genuinely do not understand is this. This is not a bluff. This is a fundamental shift in the balance of power. And it is happening right now, silently, patiently, and with very clear purpose. You have to truly understand the weight of what was communicated when the president declared that America doesn't need Canada. That was not a throwaway line tossed out carelessly. It was not mere political theater. This is the same Canada that has served as America's largest trading partner for decades, the source of nearly 60% of American crude oil, the supplier of almost all natural gas imports, and the energy backbone for 8 border states stretching from Minnesota all the way to New England. This is a nation with whom the United States has shared decades of deeply intertwined economies, supply chains, and defense commitments. When that statement landed, it was like pulling a single thread from a carefully woven tapestry. You begin to see just how much could come apart. I have been in rooms where decisions like this get made. I have watched senior officials speak with absolute certainty, convinced that power can be asserted without consequence. But here is what you learn about relationships built this deep over this long. Every action matters. Every word matters. Every posture matters. Saying we do not need you is not simply an insult. It is a signal. And Canada read that signal with complete clarity. Because in international relations, words carry consequences even when no cameras are present. And to put it plainly, Canada is not reacting out of wounded pride or anger. They are reacting out of cold calculation. They are pivoting toward markets, partners, and strategies that serve their own interests, not Washington's. LNG projects aimed at Asia, accelerated trade discussions with Europe, and the quiet courting of investment in critical minerals. These are moves that cannot be reversed overnight, and they are being implemented carefully, methodically, and with genuine foresight. Think about energy for a moment the way most people think about the water running into their homes, without ever stopping to consider where it comes from or what would happen if it stopped. 8 American states rely on Canada for the majority of their energy needs. That means heated homes, powered factories, and lights that stay on. When leadership declares out loud that America doesn't need any of that, it is not projecting strength. It is issuing an invitation for disruption, and Canada is accepting that invitation seriously. And it is not only energy. Supply chains that remain completely invisible to most Americans are already being recalibrated. Automotive components cross the US-Canada border multiple times before a single car reaches completion. Agricultural products, lumber, rare minerals, each of these flows as part of a delicate and interconnected ecosystem. Disrupt that ecosystem, and the costs do not fall on executives or elected officials. They fall on ordinary American families, on small businesses, on workers who had nothing to do with the decision. This is what makes the original statement so genuinely dangerous. It is a moment where domestic confidence collides with international reality. And while the narrative inside Washington revolves around leverage and negotiation tactics, the reality on the ground is that Canada is moving with a clarity and patience that most Americans simply are not seeing. They are pivoting to protect their own future. And if you look carefully at the details, that pivot may come directly at America's expense. History delivers this lesson with remarkable consistency. The nations that control inputs, whether energy, minerals, or the critical nodes of global supply chains, control leverage. Canada sits on one of the richest reserves of critical minerals anywhere on Earth: lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, rare earth elements. These materials are not simply commodities sitting in the ground. They are the foundation of the next generation of technology. Electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, advanced defense platforms. Every move the United States makes that pushes Canada away risks redirecting those critical resources toward Asia or Europe instead. And once that shift takes hold, you cannot reverse it with rhetoric or tariffs. Rebuilding those relationships requires decades of sustained effort. Here is something most Americans will never hear discussed on the evening news. This is not about politics. It is about economics. It is about strategy. It is about the quiet, patient work of a country positioning itself deliberately for the future. While Washington debates loudly in public, Canada is preparing carefully in private. And when that preparation meets the statement that America doesn't need Canada, the result is not a negotiation. It is a realignment. And realignments of this nature carry consequences that ripple through everything: energy bills, grocery costs, manufacturing competitiveness, and national security alike. So here is what every American needs to genuinely consider. The loud words, the headlines, the political spin, those are distractions from the actual story. The real story is what Canada is doing while nobody is watching. And what they are doing is both methodical and deliberate. They are protecting themselves. And if the United States does not recognize the gravity of that pivot, the next decade of American energy capacity, trade strength, and economic power may look very different from anything anyone currently predicts. Because here is the fundamental truth. When you underestimate your closest ally, when you misread a relationship that has been built carefully over decades, you do not simply risk embarrassment. You risk economic and strategic disruption on a scale that most Americans are completely unprepared to confront. And that is exactly what is beginning to unfold. Here is where things become genuinely complicated and where most Americans are completely missing what is actually happening. While Washington was busy broadcasting that America doesn't need Canada, Canadian leaders were not panicking or reacting emotionally. They were calculating, planning, and moving in ways that, if you step back and look carefully at the full picture, could carry enormous consequences for the United States. Canada's pivot is not about confrontation. It is about opportunity. Take energy as the clearest example. The LNG Canada project on the British Columbia coast is far more than a pipeline or a port facility. It represents a strategic shift in how Canada thinks about its energy future. The project is designed to export Canadian liquefied natural gas directly to Asia, to Japan, South Korea, and increasingly to China. That means the energy that has historically flowed into the United States could, over time, be steadily redirected toward new markets willing to pay higher prices and offer reliable long-term contracts. This is not a threat, and it is not a bluff. It is a rational business decision made in direct response to American statements and postures that signaled Canada's importance was being dismissed. Think carefully about what that actually means. The United States depends on Canadian oil and gas for the basic functions of everyday life. Gas stations, factories, and family homes all rely on this steady and largely uninterrupted supply. 8 border states draw the majority of their energy from Canadian sources. If Canada gradually redirects even a meaningful portion of that supply toward Asia, the impact is not theoretical or distant. It is immediate and deeply personal. Families in Michigan, Minnesota, and across New England could find their heating costs climbing sharply in the middle of winter. Manufacturers could face energy bills that erode their ability to compete globally. Construction companies could watch material costs rise steeply if Canadian lumber is redirected or subjected to new trade arrangements. The people absorbing that pain are not executives sitting in boardrooms or politicians crafting statements for the cameras. They are ordinary Americans trying to manage their household budgets. But energy is only the beginning of this story. Canada is simultaneously and quietly reshaping its broader trade relationships. Conversations with the European Union about accelerating the existing CETA trade framework have gained real momentum. Deals that had been moving slowly are suddenly being treated as priorities. And then there is China, always watching, always calculating its next move. Canadian officials have been in Beijing exploring investment opportunities in critical mineral sectors: lithium, cobalt, nickel, uranium, rare earth elements. Precisely the materials that power the next generation of energy technology and advanced defense systems. The United States spent decades working to secure these supply chains outside of Chinese control. Canada was supposed to be the trusted cornerstone of that entire strategy. But when the largest customer publicly signals that it does not need Canada, the incentives that govern these decisions change entirely. And it is worth being absolutely clear that this is not about betrayal. Canada is not turning against the United States out of spite or ideology. They are acting precisely as any sovereign nation would when faced with these signals, protecting their interests, exploring alternatives, and building options that do not depend on a partner who has signaled they may not be reliable. Look again at critical minerals because they represent a dimension of this problem that most people are not fully grasping. These resources sit at the center of the next industrial era. Batteries for electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, semiconductors, and defense technology all depend on consistent and reliable access to these materials. The United States cannot simply replace Canadian supplies through some alternative arrangement overnight. If Canada chooses to prioritize Asia or Europe for the development and export of these resources, the consequences for American technological competitiveness could be profound and lasting. This is not speculation. It is strategic reality playing out in slow motion. There is another dimension most people completely overlook, and that is credibility. Canada effectively functions as the proof of concept for how the United States treats its closest allies. When Washington publicly dismisses a partnership that has been built over generations, every other ally takes careful note. Japan, South Korea, Germany, Australia, they are all watching this unfold. They are all quietly asking themselves the same question that Canada is already answering through its actions. If the United States treats its most trusted ally as a disposable asset when domestic politics demand it, why should any of them rely on Washington when their own security or economic interests are genuinely at stake? This is not paranoia or anti-American sentiment. It is straightforward geopolitical reasoning. Unpredictability is a strategic liability, not an asset. It creates powerful incentives for allies to hedge their bets. And that hedging does not happen in press conferences or public statements. It happens quietly through infrastructure investments, carefully structured trade agreements, and strategic partnerships designed to reduce dependence on Washington. That is precisely what Canada is doing at this very moment. Now bring this closer to home and make it concrete. Imagine the American energy landscape 5 or 10 years from now if Canadian natural gas and electricity flows have been meaningfully reduced. Imagine manufacturing communities across the Midwest facing persistently higher energy costs that make their products uncompetitive against global rivals. Imagine American farmers operating with fewer export markets because Canada has prioritized new trading partners who offer better terms. These are not abstract, hypothetical scenarios constructed to generate alarm. They are entirely plausible outcomes if the current trajectory continues without a serious strategic response. And the brutal irony embedded in all of this is that the statements intended to project overwhelming strength, statements like "we don't need Canada," may have actually weakened America's real position considerably. What was framed domestically as leverage has in practice created a vacuum that Canada is now filling with deliberate and purposeful strategic action. While domestic audiences respond to the display of toughness, the people eventually paying the price are ordinary Americans in their homes, on their farms, and on their factory floors. Here is what continues to get missed in virtually every discussion of this situation. Canada is not making impulsive emotional decisions. Every move is calculated, deliberate, and specifically designed to build long-term resilience and reduce vulnerability. They are securing alternative markets, constructing infrastructure that reduces their dependence on American demand, and ensuring they remain a powerful and relevant player in global energy and critical mineral markets for decades to come. Meanwhile, the United States is publicly broadcasting dismissiveness, eroding decades of carefully accumulated trust, and systematically narrowing its own strategic options without appearing to fully recognize what is happening. The message that emerges from all of this is unambiguous. When America misreads or underestimates its closest ally, the consequences extend far beyond trade disruptions. They encompass potential energy shortages, economic instability, supply chain breakdowns, and the gradual but very real erosion of global influence. And the vast majority of Americans are entirely unaware that this quiet pivot is already well underway. Here is the hard truth that sits underneath all of this. When the United States miscalculates its relationship with Canada, the consequences do not stay contained to energy markets or trade statistics. They cascade outward. They ripple through interconnected systems. They spread quietly at first, almost invisibly, until suddenly the impact arrives directly at the kitchen tables of American families, in the paycheck calculations of American workers, and in the cost structures of American industries. And by the time that impact becomes undeniable and visible, the political fallout tends to be severe. Start again with energy because it remains the most immediate and tangible pressure point. The LNG Canada project is not simply about exporting natural gas to new customers. It is about fundamentally redirecting global energy flows in ways that serve Canadian long-term interests. Asia's appetite for energy is growing rapidly, and Canada is positioning itself strategically to meet that demand. The energy that has historically flowed reliably into 8 American border states, keeping homes warm through brutal winters in Michigan and Minnesota, powering manufacturing operations in Ohio and Pennsylvania, could gradually begin flowing elsewhere. Not all at once in a dramatic and visible disruption, but steadily and incrementally in ways that create persistent upward pressure on costs. A family in Minneapolis adjusting their thermostat in the depths of February may have no awareness whatsoever that a political statement made in Washington months earlier is contributing to the size of their heating bill. A manufacturer in Detroit calculating whether they can remain competitive may not immediately connect their rising energy costs to strategic decisions being made thousands of miles away. A construction firm in Minnesota watching lumber prices climb may not fully understand that Canadian export patterns are shifting in response to signals sent by American leadership. Supply chains, those hidden arteries that keep American industry functioning, are already beginning to show stress. Automotive components crisscross the US-Canada border repeatedly before a finished vehicle rolls off any assembly line. Softwood lumber feeds construction activity across dozens of states. Agricultural inputs like Canadian potash keep American farming operations productive and competitive. When Canada pivots meaningfully toward Asia or Europe, these supply chains begin to fray at their edges. Delays accumulate, costs rise, and scarcity begins to affect industries that Americans depend on without ever thinking about them. And once serious disruption takes hold, recovery is never measured in months. It takes years and sustained, deliberate effort. Layer critical minerals on top of all of this, and the picture becomes even more consequential. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, uranium, rare earth elements represent the essential foundation of the next great technological revolution. The United States invested enormous effort over decades in trying to secure these supply chains outside of Chinese control, and Canada was always supposed to be the reliable cornerstone of that entire strategy. But when America publicly signals it does not need its most trusted ally, the incentives governing these decisions shift fundamentally. Canada can pursue arrangements with Asia or Europe that serve its own long-term interests, and the United States could find itself without a dependable partner for materials that are essential to electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, advanced semiconductors, and next-generation defense platforms. Rebuilding those supply chain relationships is emphatically not a short-term project. It is a generational challenge requiring sustained political will and enormous financial investment. And this is precisely where the credibility problem comes into its fullest and most damaging expression. Allies across the world are watching this unfold with careful attention. Japan, South Korea, Germany, Australia, they are all making their own quiet calculations. If the United States treats its closest and most long-standing ally as a disposable partner when domestic political narratives demand it, why should any of them place genuine trust in American commitments? Why should they structure their own economic or security arrangements around the assumption of American reliability when they can clearly see that assumption being tested and strained in real time? Unpredictability does not project power. It signals unreliability. And unreliability pushes allies toward hedging strategies that express themselves through infrastructure investments, alternative trade arrangements, and strategic partnerships deliberately designed to reduce exposure to American decision-making. When the United States eventually tries to reassert influence in these relationships, the costs of rebuilding what was lost, financially, strategically, and in terms of basic trust, tend to be astronomical. Domestic consequences compound all of these pressures simultaneously. Trade disruptions, energy price increases, and supply chain instability are absorbed first and most painfully by the families, workers, and small businesses that rarely have meaningful representation in the policy conversations that created the problem. When heating costs rise across the Midwest or manufacturing expenses climb in the industrial regions that form the backbone of the American economy, the people experiencing those changes connect them directly and sometimes viscerally to the decisions that produce them. And the political consequences that follow tend to be both significant and difficult to manage. The states most exposed to these risks are not coastal population centers. They are the industrial communities, the energy-dependent regions, and the agricultural areas that have historically formed the core of American economic and political identity. Then there is China, pursuing its interests with patience, discipline, and a strategic horizon that extends well beyond any single election cycle. Every time the United States alienates a key partner like Canada, China identifies and moves to fill the space that American miscalculation has opened. They are not announcing these moves publicly or making threatening statements. They are making deals quietly and systematically, establishing themselves in exactly the positions that American indecision and strategic overconfidence leave available. Canadian critical minerals, LNG export capacity, and redirected trade flows all represent potential pathways for deeper Chinese engagement. And if the United States continues to underestimate the significance and speed of this pivot, the result will not simply be lost commercial leverage. It will be a meaningful shift in global power dynamics that may prove extraordinarily difficult to reverse across any reasonable time frame. What is most concerning about the full trajectory of this situation is that it moves slowly enough to be consistently underestimated right up until the moment its consequences become unavoidable and very hard to address. Canada is not acting irrationally or emotionally. They are acting with the logic of a sovereign nation that has received clear signals about how its most important relationship is being valued, and is responding by building alternatives that protect its long-term interests regardless of what Washington ultimately decides to do. Every delay in recognizing the seriousness of this shift, every additional week of posturing over substantive engagement, increases the probability that Canada's pivot will reach a point of no return. Once new trade routes are fully established, once new partnerships are operating at scale, once new energy infrastructure is built and committed to long-term contracts, reversing those arrangements becomes not merely difficult, but practically impossible. Decades of trust and economic interdependence, built through sustained effort across generations, could ultimately be undermined by a pattern of statements and postures whose domestic political benefits were measured in days while their strategic costs compound across years. This is not a partisan observation, and it is not a political talking point designed to serve any particular agenda. It is a strategic reality that cuts cleanly across all conventional political boundaries. The relationship between the United States and Canada is among the most consequential bilateral relationships anywhere in the world. It is built into the everyday functioning of millions of American lives, woven into the fabric of national security, economic strength, and the credibility of American commitments globally. And that relationship is under genuine and serious strain right now, not because of some distant foreign adversary pursuing its interests, but because of miscalculations made at home whose full consequences have not yet been honestly reckoned with. The question is not whether Canada will act in its own interest. Every nation does, and always will. The real question is whether the United States will recognize clearly and honestly what is actually happening and respond with the seriousness and strategic depth that the situation genuinely demands. Because the cost of continuing to get this wrong is not measured in news cycles or polling numbers or the outcomes of any single political confrontation. It is measured in energy bills that rise and do not come back down, in manufacturing operations that become uncompetitive and eventually close, in strategic relationships that erode quietly until the moment they are needed most and are no longer available. The window for a genuine course correction remains open, but it will not remain open indefinitely. And every day that passes without a clear-eyed and honest strategic response to what Canada is doing and why brings the United States closer to a future it did not consciously choose and may find itself genuinely unprepared to navigate.